Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you're all enjoying your holiday break so far. I want to pause for a second and explain what this is because this is actually a partner series to the Spark. If you've seen my Spark series, it's about finding your light and your purpose and paying attention to what's guiding you through it. The Alchemy Room is about what you do with that purpose once you find it. You know, how you take the pain you've experienced and what you've been through, and you alchemize that into helping other people and changing your life, essentially. I think a lot of us confuse processing trauma with living in it. And those two things are very different. Processing trauma means you acknowledge what you've been through and you acknowledge what happened and you let yourself be honest about how it affected you, and then you decide what you're going to do with that information. However, living in it looks like replaying it over and over, letting it define you, letting it bleed into every part of your life, and making excuses for your behavior because of it. And pain evolves over time, whether you process it or not. If you ignore it, it does not disappear, it just shows up and different areas of your life, like your relationships and your work and your friendships and even your boundaries and self-talk. And we talk a lot on this podcast about the importance of being trauma informed, especially in educational environments. You know, when you work with students, it's so important to be trauma informed so that you can understand where their behavior is coming from. But it's just as important to be trauma informed with ourselves, because when you don't understand your own patterns, you end up reacting instead of responding. Being trauma informed with yourself means noticing, oh, that reaction did not come from this. It came from a past hurt. And instead of judging yourself for that, you get curious about it. And that curiosity and that self-awareness is what creates the change. When you understand where your own triggers come from, your boundaries get healthier, your friendships get a lot more meaningful, and everything just gets a lot more honest in your life. You stop taking things personally when it comes to other people's projections, because um, you can really recognize when they're just operating from that pain. And that's really the whole concept of the Alchemy Room. It's how we alchemize and transmute our pain into power. So today we are going to be talking about the best teacher I ever had. She was actually my favorite teacher. She started teaching me, as early as I can remember. Her name is Miss Trauma. Before we get into the examples, I want to preface this because I really don't want this show to ever feel like it's surface level. I want to be able to open up with some of the traumatic things that I've experienced in my life, and I'm going to do that at some point. But as of now, I'm just not in a place where I feel ready to do that yet. But we'll get there eventually. Today's focus, in the meantime, is just going to be what I can help you with when it comes to recognizing patterns with others and yourself, building awareness, and just changing how that pain shows up in your life. One of the biggest things I've learned in my healing journey is that most of our behavior is driven by our nervous system, especially when it's dysregulated. When our nervous system feels unsafe, the brain's only job is to protect itself. So people lash out, they withdraw, they become defensive, and they say things that they don't fully mean or react in ways that don't match reality. I've seen a lot of people stay in friendships and relationships, myself included, out of comfort. We tell ourselves things like, they don't know any better, they're misunderstood, they've been through this, and that's just how they were raised. And while that compassion matters, so does accountability. At some point, every one of us has a responsibility to become more aware of our patterns and how they affect other people. And pain may explain behavior, but it doesn't justify it. So I'm going to be sharing a few examples of what these behaviors can look like, because these patterns show up everywhere. One example that comes into conversations about unhealed behavior is the word narcissist. People throw that word around a lot, and the truth is, narcissistic personality disorder is a real clinical diagnosis. It's not a personality trait. It's not the same thing as being conceited or self centered, but at its core, narcissistic personality disorder is rooted in trauma, not confidence, not self love, trauma. And it's often a defense that develops when someone's sense of safety or identity was disrupted really early on. The manipulation, the lack of empathy, the control. These aren't always signs that someone is a bad person, but they're signs of protection. One of the hardest things about narcissistic patterns is that the person often can't or won't acknowledge their behavior. There's very little self reflection, very little accountability, and without confrontation or consequences, there's often no internal motivation to change. And that's why simply being understanding doesn't help them. If behavior is never named, the pattern continues. And that can be incredibly difficult to confront, especially if it's someone you've known for a long time or someone that you love. And that's why discernment and emotional intelligence is so important, because you can understand where a behavior comes from and still decide that it's not something you're willing to tolerate in your life. Compassion doesn't mean you have to stay accessible to harm. Not every difficult person is a narcissist, and not every projection is narcissism. But when someone consistently lacks accountability and deflects responsibility or rewrites reality, gaslighting, manipulation, any of that, that's not miscommunication. That is something that's unhealed. And they're trying to defend themselves and protect themselves. The second example I want to talk about is envy. And this is just my personal opinion, but I think that envy is one of the most dangerous emotions a person can carry and one of the most harmful to project onto others. Feeling jealousy doesn't make someone bad. It's human. We all notice when someone has something we want or a life that we desire. The problem is when that feeling isn't acknowledged for what it is. Historically, envy has driven people to do really extreme things. It's been at the root of betrayal and sabotage and violence. It's totally internal. And it's like people are threatened by something that actually isn't threatening them. And similarly to narcissism, people rarely admit that what they're feeling is envy. Internally, it shows up as irritation. Someone who is dealing with envy may say things like, I just don't like them. I don't know what it is. I just don't like them. They're annoying. Something like that. And it's as if the need to humble someone or suddenly question motives or minimize them makes them feel better about themselves, makes them feel more protected in their ego. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of that, it can feel really confusing and isolating. You might start to dim yourself or act quiet to be accepted. Again, this doesn't mean someone is bad. It just means that there is something unresolved there. Now, a healthy thought pattern turns inward. It asks, what do I want to work toward? What can I learn from this person that I'm envious of? Like, what in me is lacking that makes me feel that way toward them? And, what can I work on in myself and be happy within myself? Ego turns outward. It asks, why do they get that? They don't deserve that. And that's why awareness matters so much here. It is such a projected emotion that over time, it usually reveals itself without you having to say a word. Patterns become visible. Other people eventually notice what you noticed, and sometimes even noticed it before you do. All you can really do is decide how much access that person gets to you moving forward. It's not the kind of a trauma response that you can really confront people about. The third projection I want to talk about is people pleasing. For a long time, as in the last 20 or so years, this was something that I really struggled with. When you grow up in environments where safety depended on keeping the peace, you learn really quickly how to read a room. People pleasing projects trauma outward by prioritizing everyone else's comfort at the expense of your own. You say yes when you're actually unsure, you over-explain, you apologize for things that you don't need to apologize for. And you take responsibility for emotions that aren't yours to manage. And the reason it can be so hard to acknowledge within yourself is because people pleasing often gets rewarded. You are seen as nice and giving and agreeable and helpful. And what I had to learn is that people pleasing isn't the same thing as being a gifting and a loving person. It's a survival strategy that says, if I keep everyone else regulated, I'll be safe. And here's what I want you to know: safety that costs your voice or your talents or even parts of your personality isn't actually safety. When you stop people pleasing, a lot of your relationships will change. But from my experience, the only ones that change are those that relied on your self abandonment and those that were never meant for you to begin with. And that's a really important distinction. People who benefited from your lack of boundaries may struggle with the new version of you, but people who actually care about you will adjust. Hyperindependence is often one that also gets praised, especially in high achieving environments. Hyperindependence forms when you once relied on others and it felt unsafe or disappointing or punishing. So you learn, I'll just do everything myself. It looks like struggling to ask for help, feeling resentful, um, pride in not needing anyone, discomfort receiving care, or softness. So, independence isn't the issue here, but isolation is. And just because you like being alone doesn't mean you're hyper independent, okay? Even as a social person, I love my alone time. I like to be alone in my house 90% of the time with my dogs and a bunch of snacks. Okay. That's not hyper independence. That's just enjoying alone time. But I've dealt with hyper independence in the past, and now I believe that we deserve the same loyalty and effort that we give others. But we really have to choose that to begin with. We have to choose those people to begin with. So healing this trauma means allowing interdependence, letting people show up and choosing who actually gets that access. And then the last one I have for you guys today is chronic self-monitoring. And this one often goes unnoticed because it's internal. It's all internal. And I struggled with this for years and I still do sometimes. I probably will for the rest of my life. I think it's just ingrained in me. Um, but my point is, even though I still have that, I'm able to alchemize that into doing other things like this podcast, which I don't like to be in my comfort zone. I don't like being monitored. I really didn't have a social media presence ever. Like, I always kept my social media on my Instagram and everything very private. But again, this is how you take trauma like that and transmute it into something else. But anyway, this develops when being aware of how you were perceived once felt necessary for safety. So you just learn to constantly scan yourself. This shows up in kids or adults that have dealt with constant criticism from family members or dealt with bullying from peers. So you start to track your tone and your facial expressions, your energy in the room. You notice who seems uncomfortable. You notice who's eyeing you. And honestly, being this perceptive can often make you come off as socially awkward. And that is something that I really dealt with in my teens because I was so anxious and hyper aware of everything going on around me that I kind of just went inside and I felt embarrassed all the time. It looks like replaying conversations after they happen, wondering if you said too much or not enough, shifting your personality depending on who you're with. Um, and even feeling anxious after conversations that went well. Over time, chronic self-monitoring disconnects you from your intuition. You start trusting feedback and reactions and other people's projections more than your own internal cues. You don't have to manage others to feel safe. You're allowed to take up space without auditing yourself the entire time. So anyways, these are just some of the projections that I've noticed most clearly in my own life, but obviously trauma shows up in a lot of different ways and it's rarely just one pattern. And the point isn't to label yourself or make excuses for it because you're traumatized. It's to start noticing that, noticing what keeps repeating and what you can learn from it. So if any of this resonated with you, don't be too hard on yourself. Self-awareness is the first step, and these patterns usually start as protection in your childhood. If there are any other dynamics or behaviors that you guys would like me to talk about, leave a comment and let me know. Obviously, it's a very broad spectrum, so I'm happy to go into further depth, and I'm happy to keep unpacking this stuff in future episodes. I hope everyone has a really good holiday, and I will see you next time.